Hi there. In this second video of the series, What is the Magellan Course? I want to talk about some distinctions that we set up in the first video, and those are the distinctions between what we might term postmodernism and post-postmodernism, or as I have it here, post-PoMO. And these distinctions are valuable not so much in terms of the content that the Magellan Course is most interested in, but in terms of the trajectory away from the types of thinking, being, and learning and action logics that are currently either being utilized or being moved onto from what the Magellan Course is most interested in. And so in terms of the first video, we talked about a frontier, and everything we're going to talk about today is on the near side of that frontier. So these will be distinctions that are set up to help us understand what the Magellan Course is trying to move beyond. So we're trying to move even beyond postmodernism or post-PoMO. Okay. So if we look at, we can make a grid of some of these distinctions. And what I want to do here is say that this is the postmodern version of different aspects that we're going to look at. This would be the postmodern version. We will look at the postmodern version as a reaction against what came before. So this would be what it's reacting to. In many cases, that's the modern version, but we want to highlight that the postmodern is, in many respects, a reaction against what came before. So those are some of the ways we're going to set this up. The postmodern to the post-postmodern is not so much a reaction, but in general, there's this process of building on some of the value of the postmodern into a new integrative postmodern. So I just want to highlight that in general the postmodern was a reaction, is reactionary against the previous forms, and the postmodern movement is more integrative. So that is a first distinction we can make, that the postmodern was in general reactive, whereas the post-postmo tends to be or concentrate on being integrative. So you hear words as transcend and include the postmodern, whereas the postmodern is trying to make more of an actual reactive break against what has come before. And so people like Gendlin will say that the postmodern has overstated the reaction. And the post-postmodern is now trying to be synthetic, to reclaim some of what has gone before. So that's a first distinction. The other categories that I want to look at is a category we could call what's the different views. The overall view that these different mindsets are operating from. And I would say that the post-PoMO view, as many of you will not be surprised, is perspectival. So, culminating with Ken Wilber, we've been able to actually identify and map the perspectives from which all these different views and methodologies are arising. In these perspectives, this mapping of this perspectival domains is an attempt to be integrative and synthetic. So this move builds on the postmodern view, which was relative. That there were many views and they were all relative to each other. In the way the integrative or synthetic move in post-PoMO built on that is saying, yes, they're all relative, but they can be contextualized by this map of perspectives. This relative aspect, we can see, was a reaction against absolutism. So prior to the understanding that views are perspectival, which accounts for the fact that they're seen to be relative, is a reaction against the fact that opinions and knowledges and worldviews are not absolutely real for all frames. And so perspectival is a map of the, we could say, the frames of reference. And you see this in science as well as in the humanities. This brings up to the domain, let's say, we'll call it just the domain of knowledge. And we want to look at the post-PoMO, or the most recent understanding or approach to knowledge. And in general, the treatment of the knowledge domain is through what we might call injunctions or methodologies. And this relates to perspectival. So different injunctions will elicit different perspectival frames, different methodologies will elicit different types of evidence or data. The move then, the synthetic move then into here would be to be transdisciplinary through the methods or injunctions, or we have methodological pluralism, integral methodological pluralism. We see that recent approach. This methodological pluralism was built on the notion of a hermeneutic circle and shared discourse that emerged during the postmodern term, and that was a reaction against a pretty strict empiricism. We can then look at what we might call, or how do the different views receive or find meaning. In the modern age, the general way to find meaning was to assume that it was discoverable, that it was out there as something ontologically real, as something constant in nature, as something absolute and empirically real, and it could be discovered. As a reaction against that, the postmodern said, postmodern movement thought of meaning as being inventable. So you weren't so much discovering meaning as inventing it through different methodologies by taking on different perspectives and frames. Not only was it inventable, so we have this concept of being constructed, that meaning is constructed. When that gets incorporated to this concept of taking on different perspectives, being methodologically pluralistic, being synthetic and integrative, then the turn from postmodern to a more recent understanding is that meaning is actionable. And so you start to see words such like enactment, an enactment theory. An enactment enfolds all these concepts, these integrative concepts, so that you enact meaning through different injunctions, for example. So that would be another move between these three different views. This is then also related to what a lot of people talk about, is that in the postmodern era, meaning was all about the context. Prior to that, it was all about the content, as if the content was just out there to be discovered. And building on that, we have that meaning is context independent. According to grades or hierarchies, there's some search to create a grading system or a model or methodology of grading context. And that grading system is itself considered context independent. When we look at the aptitudes that are important in these views, we see that in postmodern, the aptitude that's most important is therefore meta-theory. Because meta-theory is the aptitude that generates these supposed or assumed, or the goal is to be, context-independent models of content and context. That meta-theory has been built on mediated discourse. And what I mean by mediated discourse is discourse, critical inquiry and discourse that has been mediated to uncover the context dependency of certain opinions or data or understandings. So mediated discourse was much more related just to hermeneutics, and building on that, there's this understanding that meta-theory not only mediates discourse, but can come up with ways to grade, either in a hierarchical or some kind of grading system, where the context and the content become themselves contextualized. The context itself becomes contextualized through this context-independent meta-theory. And the mediated discourse was a reaction to just really using senses. So empiricism, for example, relied heavily on observational techniques that themselves were developed through technology. This is very closely related then. What do we rely on to explain the knowledge or our view? And in this sense, I'll just come across here because it ties in very closely, is in this area it was perception. Just our perception categories, our observations, our hearing, our sight. And as a reaction to that, there was a focus on language. And building on those two, the synthetic or integrative move is to look at patterns of both language and perception. If we look at what kind of process dynamics are most in play, we find that in the most recent area, what we're calling post-PoMO, we primarily see developmental processes. These patterns almost are entirely developmental, and these meta-theories almost entirely draw on developmental hierarchies. This has been built on the previous relational processes, or sliding context, people like to say. And that was a reaction to primarily a mechanical or mechanistic process mentality. If we look at the domain of inquiry that was the focus in most of these views, then we find that we are entering in the post-PoMO realm or view, inquiry at the scale of the planet. And the planet itself has become an object of discourse. So prior to the post-postmodern, the pieces of the planet were looked at. Ecologies, geographies, societies, geological, biophysical, species. But with the post-postmodern, we see that the planet itself is construed as a monad or an agentic monad. The word Gaia brings that to mind, or an organism. So this is very recent that it's been able to be actually the scale at which the inquiry is happening. This has been built on the postmodern domain of inquiries, primarily culture, and that was a reaction to basically just looking at nature and thinking that people and cultures were identical to natural systems or physical nature as a physical system, a reductive system. So these are the primary distinctions we can make in terms of watching the movement or the journey from the modern era, and how the postmodern reaction to the modern era derived of different set of views, and how the post-PoMO or the integrative or integral or synthetic era built on what has been happening, both the action and the reaction, into a more integrative view. And just down here, to make to expand this into ethics and morality, we could say that in terms of ethics, the distinctions we could make are that in postmodern, the ethics were relativistic or situational. So you have situational ethics. What would you do in this situation? Instead of, as a reaction to this notion that there is there is an identifiable and absolute good answer to this ethical question. And that is been built on in an integrative manner to think of what's authentic. So you're not just laissez-faire situational, but how are you authentic to what is perhaps a good principle in yourself. And in terms of morality, the distinctions we could make is from the concept that there are discoverable absolute principles to the notion that there is the right thing to do, which is starting to incorporate the situation in this relativistic idea, to a move toward something that would be more classified as spirituality. And we can combine these two words to think of what is happening now in a post-modern view is the kind of search for an authentic spirituality. So those are some of the distinctions that I think are important as we look at what is come before, how the postmodern views are, in a sense, more dramatically reactionary to the modern domains and views, and that the move from postmodern to post-postmodern is a more of an integrative or synthetic move, and with that is arising a whole different worldview or view across many different domains. And in the next video, we'll look at the edge of that frontier from even the integrative move to the territory that the Magellan Course really wants to voyage to.